Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
But we'll begin with Brexit, and here's a question for you. We could probably get 3 hours out of this. In fact, we could probably do it every hour except Mystery Hour this week and just clock off at 1 o'clock on Friday. The big question surrounding Brexit is what happens now? What's going on? But where do we start is the question I'd like to begin with. Where do we start? I don't know anymore. I thought that by Christmas 2016, genuinely, I thought my worst fears would have been assuaged. I thought we'd have all moved on and that Remainers would have been mollified with the thoughts that things aren't going to be as bad as they potentially could be. All of the arch Brexiters who apparently didn't understand anything and yet kept arguing and kept talking would have been quietened down. Theresa May putting key Brexit campaigners in the most important positions in her cabinet. At the time, I thought that's a very good tactic because they're not going to have any choice but to recognise the reality of their own absurdity or just mistaken wrong-headedness. I thought maybe I could see the makings of a plan. But of course, as the narrative changed a little bit this weekend, I've seen some people saying, why didn't we get behind Norway? Why didn't we all get behind something we could all do? Which is kind of what we were saying in the first 6 months after the referendum. But the short answer to that was, of course, racism. The freedom of movement was weaponised in such a way that there was no earthly way you could ever have floated a Norway-style deal or a Switzerland-style deal. Both countries in the Schengen Treaty for a start. There's no earthly way you could have floated that. I mean, people have forgotten what the atmosphere was like when Paul Dacre was sticking his disgusting headlines on the front of the Daily Mail about enemies of the people and saboteurs. And if it had been suggested then by Theresa May that we're going to do a deal, it will allow us to strike our own trade deals with other countries and other markets, but we can't surrender freedom of movement because that would be stupid. She'd have been lynched. She really would. I'm 99.9% sure of that. We can all agree on that. If Theresa May had done anything which included the retention of free movement of citizens of this country into the 27 other countries in the EU and vice versa, she would have been barbecued by Christmas of 2016. So 8 minutes after 10 is the time. I want to know what you would do if you were her. And it may be that will highlight some of our own misunderstandings. It may be that if I think Theresa May could do this, X, Y, Z, and you will point out to me that's impossible because ABC, then that will be illuminating as well. But some astonishing things happened this weekend. There was some profoundly troubling quotes in the Sunday Times particularly, and I mention the newspaper because the political editor there, Tim Shipman, I think now stands head and shoulders above most, if not all, of his colleagues in the lobby when it comes to the access to power that he has. I've known Tim for 20 years plus, actually, and we go way back, and I've watched his career develop in a way that has been really gratifying and delightful. You never know when you're kids in your 20s drinking Stella Artois in the Mad Hatter down by Blackfriars Bridge. You never know which way careers are going to go. Quite often the people that you think are going to do best fall by the wayside or lose faith in the industry, and quite often the people you think are useless. Actually, that's not true. People you think are useless don't really prosper in the media much anymore. There are a few exceptions, but they usually get found out. They might rise up the ladder very, very swiftly, but their descent can be equally swift when it turns out that they were better at talking the talk than they were at walking the walk. And of course, none of my generation have gone down the Rich Rod Littlejohn route of being a sort of pocket provocateur for increasingly right-wing interests. So I've watched Shipman's career with great interest, and I've enjoyed seeing him become the doyen of political journalists and a brilliant best-selling author. And what he had so the reason I've just given you chapter and verse on how well I know him and how highly I rate him is because I appreciate that we're living in an environment now where I say there was some journalism and you are perfectly entitled to say, yeah, well, I don't believe anything that I read. So I'm just giving you my personal knowledge of this particular journalist and why I take everything he writes as accurate, fair, and exceptionally well-sourced. And some of the quotes he had this weekend about Theresa May being in the killing zone and nooses and a bit stabbed in the front, and to the extent that he's had to come out on Twitter and disassociate one MP who was being suggested as a source for these comments from the comments. But it's an atmosphere so febrile and so unpleasant that it confirms my worst and darkest fears, which is if it becomes an exercise in denying reality, where does it end? I mean, if your only job now as a Brexiter is to keep pretending that everything can be okay, what do you do next? There are now doors slamming in your face right across the world. And domestically, one guy, the fella that used to be Ian Duncan Smith's bag carrier, Tim Montgomery, in the Mail on Sunday yesterday, essentially arguing that we can't pull out now, even though it's going really badly, we can't pull out now because it would be really embarrassing to admit that we made a mistake. I may have paraphrased him slightly, but that was something I predicted to you 6 months ago was going to happen. We'll end up saying, oh, we can't pull out now because we'll look stupid. No, we won't all look stupid. Very, very small number of people will look stupid. Some people will be a little bit embarrassed that they believed that very, very small number of people, but there's no shame in that. We've all believed things that turned out not to be true in our lives. This curious aligning of the planets at the moment, though, is scary. The way they talked about Theresa May this weekend, 2 years after Joe Cox was murdered, 2.5 years after Joe Cox was assassinated by a racist terrorist, by a white supremacist terrorist, to talk of a female politician, and maybe this is my low-level sexism coming into play, but I can't help feeling differently about a female politician from how I do to a male. I think it's because you presume somehow that men can look after themselves physically and that the women are more vulnerable. I don't know. That's just where I am. It's how I was raised. I don't apologise for it at all. But when you see a female politician, a prime minister, being talked about in such vicious and violent terms by members of her own party, you realise that the desperation to deny reality could lead us to ever darker places. So that would be the sick side of the reality denial. The silly side of the reality denial would be suggestions this weekend. I don't know if you saw these. I think it was Christopher Hope in the Telegraph that tweeted about it. I don't buy the Telegraph, so I don't know whether it was in the paper. Suggested that Theresa May will be replaced as Prime Minister, but not as leader of the Conservative Party, by a sort of cabal-led coup within the Tory ranks. So presumably it's constitutionally possible to do this. I can't think of a precedent, but you would see her avoid the need to go to the country or even to the membership because she'd still be leader of the Conservative. I don't know how that works, actually, mathematically, but I definitely read it, unless I was dreaming. And that is designed to put David Davis into Downing Street. So, I mean, I don't use the word delusional very often, actually, because it's one of those words associated with mental health issues that I don't think should be trivialised necessarily by being injected into the mainstream of the public discourse quite so readily. But occasionally it's the only cap that fits. Can you imagine being so delusional that you would look at someone's failure to do a job with even the vaguest scintilla of competence as a qualification for promotion? David Davis's job for the best part of 2.5 years was to come up with a plan for getting out of the European Union. That was his job. That was his only job. Not only to come up with a plan, but to negotiate with the European Union in a way that facilitated and accelerated that departure. That was his job. He uncomplainingly took home or grossed 130, 140 off the top of my head, £1,000 a year to do that job. And he failed on a scale that even Chris Grayling would struggle to have achieved. And that is really saying something, isn't it? What did you manage to achieve during your over 2 years as Secretary of State for leaving the European Union? Absolutely nothing. Okay, so what is the response of the ERG, the ludicrously named is it European Research Group, led by the mewling pencil that is Jacob Rees-Mogg? What is their response to someone failing to achieve absolutely anything while having responsibility for negotiating our departure for the Europe? Well, I think we should make him Prime Minister. What? Laus Deo, praise the Lord. I think we should make him Prime Minister. Insert relatively irrelevant Latin phrase learnt by rote as a child to impress a doting grandparent and pass it off to the plebs as evidence of a deep intellect and a sound education. Cogito ergo sum. Really? So David Davis, who didn't even know that Germany isn't allowed to negotiate bilateral trade deals? David Davis, who didn't even know how the European Union worked, despite having dedicated his entire life to campaigning to leave it? He should be made Prime Minister now? That will somehow improve the situation that he has done more than anybody else to render ridiculously difficult. This was the moment for me. This was the moment where I finally accepted that there are people sitting in this crowd, standing in this crowd next to me, who will insist that the emperor has got clothes on, even as their noses are pressed against his naked buttocks and he breaks wind. They will continue to insist that he's wearing lovely clothes and that is the waft of Chanel No. 5 on the breeze. That's the moment for me. Anybody with a functioning cerebral cortex, if that's the neurologically correct terminology, who looks at the current mess and thinks, I know what we need to do. We need to put David Davis in charge. That is the moment, isn't it, where you realise you might as well be talking Swahili to some of these people for all the sense that it will make to them. I'm looking at a situation of almost unprecedented political chaos caused by these ludicrous people who insist on calling themselves Brexiteers. I think something out of the Beano in about 1973. I'm looking at unprecedented political chaos, and I'm seeing people thinking, well, the best way to fix this chaos is to put the people that caused it in charge. So, well, they've kind of been in charge. You know what, Boris Johnson's people... I'm in one of those moods. What time is it? 10:17. I think I could carry on till 12. We'd better take a break. But very briefly, do you know what Boris Johnson's people are saying? They're casting doubt on David Davis's fitness to become Prime Minister and lead the Brexit negotiations because he had such an important role up until his resignation over Chequers. That's Boris Johnson, the former Foreign Secretary's people, suggesting that David Davis, the former Secretary of State for leaving the European Union, shouldn't get promoted to Prime Minister because he didn't do a very good job as Secretary of State for leaving the European Union. Say fans of Boris Johnson, the former Foreign Secretary. This is it, isn't it? This is the moment we can all agree. Because if you and I are sworn political enemies and you're sitting there with your nose pressed up against Jacob Rees-Mogg's naked buttocks and convincing yourself that he's wearing silken trews or lederhosen, you're never going to change. You can at least agree about that. You are sitting there now thinking, yes, put David Davis in charge. That would be absolutely brilliant. I despair of normal political analysis at this point. So we won't do normal political analysis. We'll do this. 0345 6060 973, hand on heart, and I will demand a degree of understanding of the issues, although I appreciate David Davis doesn't have any, and it doesn't seem to be holding him back. What would you do if you were Theresa May? What would you do this week? 0345 6060 973. What would you do if you were Theresa May? Maybe tomorrow we'll do What Would Jesus Do? But we're not doing that for now. We're just doing the Theresa May angle. And you've had more than enough from me, so I shall crack on. Richard is in Brighton. Richard, what would you do?
Well, what would I do? If I were her, I would... Well, I'm sure if I were actually her, I'd resign and just say sod it. Because I just think, what's going on is completely appalling. Number one, what I'd like her to do is to tell the 63 MPs who belong to the ERG, I believe, which by coincidence... I've heard
80. 80 was a number bandied, or was that just the number
I don't know about 80, but I believe the ERG has 63 members. And that the thing that European Reform Group, I believe it's called, that Rees-Mogg is the chairman of.
Yes.
And by coincidence, that is almost exactly 10% of the seats in Parliament, because there are 629.
Yes.
And I think about 32 million people voted last time in the election, which means they represent about 3 million people.
I'm enjoying your mathematics, but it's you're steering us all. Yes,
is they represent a remarkably few.
They represent themselves, Richard.
Yes, okay.
They represent themselves with their funds opening in Dublin.
Yes,
that's
what I'd like.
But can she do that though? Exitus acta probat.
Can I just make this
Only if
point?
you give me permission as the first caller of the day to interject the entire programme with largely irrelevant but definitely Latin phrases.
You can say what you like. That's fine. You can be Boris for all I care.
Exitus acta probat. Carry on.
Well, I have no idea what it means. Probat. Wasn't that a kind of disinfectant?
Probat.
Anyway, yes, I heard you. I wanted to say to you this. That
Yes.
I was on the march on Saturday.
So was I.
Of which 700,000 people were there, apparently.
Yes.
And in which wasn't mentioned at all yesterday on the Telegraph version on the internet.
Are you
Not
sure?
once.
Are you certain?
I am absolutely certain because I took pictures on my phone of the entire thing, and I've got it, and I'll send them to you.
Well, what, in the print edition or the website or
The website.
Okay. Well, I suppose it's. Do you know what my motto is at the moment? I'm shocked but not surprised.
No, well, I am shocked, and believe it or not, I am so naive that I am surprised because I haven't believed that. I mean, I know that the Barclay brothers are. I won't go there, but you know.
Well,
what I mean.
I will say it for you. The Barclay brothers are committed and absolutely sincere enemies of elitism who just happen to own the Ritz and the Daily Telegraph.
And live on a little island off Sark.
They do live on a little island, but that is what all ordinary working class people do. And the doughty defenders of British interests who take money, of course, from the Barclay brothers to write articles and to spout otherwise, they are the true enemies of elitism, Richard. It's important to remember this. In fact, apart from a golden lift, it's hard to imagine how they could be better qualified to fight against elitism than to possess all of the attributes that you described. So we'll put resignation on the list. Problem is, if she resigns, very hard to see how you avoid a general election and open the door to the possibility of Jeremy Corbyn getting into Downing Street. Now, regardless of what you or I may think about that prospect, it's going to frighten the life out of the Conservative Party. And her job, of course, is to lead the Conservative Party as well as to lead the country. I also think now that it's impossible to pretend that Jeremy Corbyn is anything other than a proper Eurosceptic who wants to leave the European Union. I don't buy all this nonsense about you don't do anything while your enemy is making mistakes and stuff like that. It was tweeting on Saturday, as Richard reminds us, 700,000 people were marching through London, and Jeremy Corbyn was tweeting about terrible events in Chile 40 years ago. 40 years ago in Chile. Graham is in Liverpool. Graham, what's going on?
Yeah. Well, if I was Theresa May, I would blame the Brexiteers. Why didn't she do this? Why didn't she just stand up, give all of the facts to everybody about the fact that David Davis was in charge of negotiations for over a year and got nowhere, didn't negotiate anything for anyone. Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, absolutely useless, didn't achieve anything in his time as Foreign Secretary. Blame the Brexiteers and say, we could have had an orderly, sensible Brexit in which we stayed in the single market, we stayed in the customs union, which would mean the Northern Ireland thing.
They were her red lines at Mansion House, Graham. They weren't David. I mean, admittedly, it was red meat.
That's what she can say. I made those my red lines because this is what the Brexiteers in my party told me to do.
Romani ite domum.
I don't speak any Latin, but she didn't.
I think that means Romans go home, so that's quite a nice one. That could almost have been a Brexit slogan.
All over Parliament.
Or Romanians.
One of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years is a reticence, all politicians from all parties really, and from journalists, I have to say, from educating the public about the actual consequences of leaving the biggest and most successful and richest trading bloc in the world, and what it's actually going to mean to them in their everyday lives.
Okay. So look, she stands up, but what does it lead to? Does it lead? Because she's calling the whole thing off, or just calling a general election, or calling a proper referendum where people can give informed consent rather than utterly ill-informed consent or lack of.
On Friday, there's a second reading of Bill 208. It's the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Public Vote Bill. This was put forward by Gareth Thomas MP, and the idea is that we have a referendum on the withdrawal deal, whether we get one or not, or whether to remain in the EU, knowing now what we know.
What would happen if she did that? I mean,
we would have a referendum.
The usual suspects would have a fit, but
yes.
What would happen to her in terms of her position?
Well, she could support it, and because Jeremy Corbyn is so anti-EU, he won't, will he? He won't make any efforts. And actually, in the long run, it's probably better for the Tories that they do that, because they'll take a lot of votes. They said in the next election we're going to have a referendum and we're going to have election next month or something, lots of people like myself who've never voted Tory in our lives would vote Tory just to get the referendum.
So they could. So yeah, I'd break her promise, but she's done that a few times before.
But blame it on the Brexiteers.
Blame it also, and just say I
blame it
tried.
On the ERG. It's all
yeah,
their fault.
okay. Listen, I know that you are very well versed in these matters, much more than the average MP or indeed journalist. But if she did that, so she dissolves Parliament, calls a general election, dissolves Parliament, calls a general election based upon having a second referendum in the Conservatives' manifesto.
Yeah, well, you tweeted about this last month.
Yeah, I did, and I've done a bit of research. I mean, it was mischievous speculation, but because under the fixed term Parliament Act, she can't. But of course, all she needs to get that through is the Labour to want a general election. So I'm pretty certain she could get a majority to vote for the dissolution of Parliament and a general election.
But what's particularly frustrating is Labour plus the Lib Dems plus the SNP plus Tory rebels are a majority in the House. So actually,
but what happens to her if she does that?
Having a second referendum is something we could do, like third referendum.
But what happens to her if that happens? Because she'll get monstered by the usual subjects, by the Mewling pencils.
It's the way that you spin it. You say, look, we did it your way, and it was a massive failure. Now we're losing jobs, we're losing money.
No, I think, okay, I'm late for the news, which is my fault, not yours. But the problem with that, of course, is this denial of reality. So they blame it all on, they blame it on Jean-Claude Juncker, they'll blame it on Lily Allen, they'll blame it on me, they'll blame it on Remainers, they'll blame it on Brussels, they'll blame it on the boogie. And I think it's fair to say that this is the week where Theresa May will come to fully appreciate the wisdom of the motto of the United States Merchant Marine Academy, which, as fellow scholars of Latin, you will know is, of course, acta non verba. Deeds, not words. So what will those deeds be? We don't know. Which is why we're asking what you would do if you were Theresa May and you had recognised that now is the time. Now is the time. Nunc est tempus? Nunc est tempus? Nunc est tempus pro acta non verba. If I've got those first four words right, then my mum will be so pleased that her hard-earned cash was so well spent on my education. Nunc est tempus? Now is the time? Anyone? Anyway, definitely acta non verba. Why on earth, if you're just tuning in, you may be wondering, is James peppering the programme with largely meaningless Latin phrases? It's a tribute to Jacob Rees-Mogg and his band, the Mewling Pencils. 10:36 is the time. I've got all their albums. Jacob Rees-Mogg and the Mewling Pencils, coming soon to a stadium near you. Graham is in Pontypridd. Graham, what would you do if you were Theresa May and you recognised the importance of acta non verba?
Well, I recognise that immediately, of course, James. Good morning. And the thing that she should do now is much the same as the rest of your callers said, is resign, but use her resignation speech to actually lay the blame where the blame actually lays.
Yes.
Her credibility, I think, then amongst the population it'd go stratosphere. It'd become stratospheric.
Yes.
And I know you're saying, that people would then straight to her and they would monster her and that sort of thing. Well, I'm sure that they would. But, these people who would do that, But
that would be failure, wouldn't it? Because they're obsessed with legacy. The last Prime Minister to be obsessed with legacy, David Cameron, is, of course, now confined to a shed in his back garden, sharpening his crayons while he writes his memoirs. But she would... I think history might judge her incredibly kindly if she had the guts to pull us out of the fire before it engulfs us. But I'm not 100% sure.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because I'm pretty sure about that. In as much as, you've got to consider the people who would be criticising, the people who would be trying to monster her then. Their reputation started in the gutter and is working its way down.
Well, the problem with this, though, is that we're preaching to the choir, aren't we, you and I, to each other, essentially, whereas there are still lots and lots of people out there who don't yet understand that it could never have gone well. Not from the moment of Article 50 plus Lancaster House, not Mansion House, my apologies.
Yeah.
They refuse to believe it. They think that somehow... There was a bloke on the Sky News with Farage at the weekend talking about going back to the days of the British Empire, when he'd have been living in a ditch if we went back to the days of the British Empire. If he was lucky, he'd probably be press-ganged into the Royal Navy or something. That's these people are still there and they still have a vote.
Well, I know, James, but in every circus you get clowns.
And it's a lovely phrase. What is it? What is it in Latin?
I've absolutely no idea. I couldn't even tell you in Welsh. But you see, I mean, the numbers of these people who are not seeing the light, then, as it were, is diminishing. I mean, there was this, 700,000, maybe 750,000 on the weekend.
It's a lot less than 17 million votes, though, isn't it? 700,000 on a march. So she resigns, she lays responsibility. But you know what that does? That opens the door at Downing Street to Jeremy Corbyn.
But you see, that wouldn't be such a bad thing, I would have thought, for them, because Brexit, whoever takes the helm here, is a poison chalice.
Let him do it. That's a very good point,
yeah,
actually.
Let him fail.
It's not very much in the national interest, though, is it?
Oh, none of this is in the national interest, James. This is in the interest of the Tory party.
Call it off. Tempt John Major back from retirement and get him to set up a coalition government with Gordon Brown. There you go.
No. Resurrect Attlee. Bring him back.
Clement Attlee. Graham, you just said you're a Jeremy Corbyn supporter.
I am.
That's fine, absolutely. But what gives you? Do you think he wants to stay in the European Union or leave it?
No, I don't think he does.
Oh, but you still like him?
He is. But hang on, no, James. He is actually leading a party now where 86% of the membership of that party want to remain. Now he's talking about returning the Labour Party to the members. Well, you can't have the penny on the... you can't have everything here. It's either one thing or the other. And if you return the Labour Party to the membership, as it should be, then the members are saying, 86% of them anyway, saying we want to remain, then he is going to have to take heed. And if there's one thing that he is at the end of the day, he's a Democrat.
Well, you say that, and you are perfectly entitled to hold that view. I'm in need of a little more persuasion, but I'm perfectly entitled to hold that view as well.
You always are, James.
Well, you know why. You know why, don't you, Graham?
Why, go on.
Montani semper liberi.
Oh, dear, of course.
Yes.
I'd forgotten all about that.
Thank you very much. Never forget. Montani semper liberi. Mountaineers are always free. Anthony's in Northampton. Anthony, what would you do?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Anthony.
Firstly, let me tell you
that
your show is bloody brilliant.
Oh, blimey. Do you know, I couldn't tell then. I thought you were going to go the other way, Anthony.
You do conflate issues sometimes.
Of course I do.
You do try and conflate and
I'm not
confuse
perfect.
people. But anyway, let me say what I'm going to say.
Carry on.
I think Theresa May should carry on as she's doing. And what will happen is that she'll commit political suicide for herself and a party.
Well, but when, sorry to interrupt, but when, though? Do you see what I mean? Because we
Well, it doesn't matter when.
Well, it does matter when, because she'll take the whole country...
Next week, next month, or 6 months.
She'll take the whole country with her if it...
suicide.
Yeah, I hear you, and I like the idea, up until the point where I warn you that she'll take the whole country with her.
No, she won't. No, she won't, James. Because what will happen is enough level-headed people will get to grip with the task and sort it out.
Really?
At the moment, she's absolutely, along with Boris Johnson, along with Davis. I've always called him Dumb Davis.
Very
he hasn't got a brain in his head.
No, he had. Well, I mean, physically he must have, but the evidence is scant. Yes.
I was a leaver. I voted to leave.
That's all right.
But because of the hash they made of it, I've just changed my mind completely.
I'm gonna let you get away with that.
Sense in what you're saying, you haven't brainwashed me.
No.
Although you've had a bloody good try.
It's not brainwashing, mate. It's illumination. Illumination. That is my modus ponens.
You're very good, James, and I think you're wonderful. I think we pity we haven't got more presenters like you on LBC.
Couldn't agree more.
But anyway, all I'm going to say is that I've got 5 grandchildren, and I fear for their future now.
Well, I hope that we're all wrong, and that if there is something to be rescued from this mess, then it will be rescued quickly. But I worry, and I like your prediction or your suggestion that she should carry on. Obviously, you're not telling me what you would do if you were her. You're telling me what you would want her to do, or what you hope she will do, and that's perfectly welcome as well on the programme, but I don't see how she can. I mean, this is the point, isn't it? The point at which everybody finally realises that it's gone very badly. People will still insist, and Anthony, you did come close to doing this, will still insist that it could have gone less badly. I personally think freedom of movement being weaponised and fetishised made that impossible. But if everybody finally realises that it's gone very badly, it will be too late. Because if we wanted to get back in, we would have to sign up to the single currency and to the Schengen Treaty. And I'm not sure that is necessarily bad. I don't know enough. I haven't dug deep enough into what that would mean for Britain. But I think certainly at this point in our economic history, we're quite glad we're not in the euro. So it's tough to see how a form of political harry-kiri on her part could not have repercussions on a much grander stage than merely the Conservative Party or her own career. Let's get these five. Actually, what time is it? 10:44. Tom's in Bromley. Tom, I'll squeeze you in. What would you like to say?
Thanks, James. I went on that march yesterday. On Saturday.
Yes.
Out of utter frustration that there was I knew it wasn't going to have any particular effect.
Yes.
But at least it was something I could do.
Do you know my favourite banner, which I think sums up if I've understood you if I've understood you correctly? I think you might have been in a similar position to me. I saw a banner and it said, "Things must be bad if I'm here."
I didn't see that. That's wonderful.
That was pretty much how I felt. On the things must be, because I don't do things like this. I don't go on marches.
No. There was another brilliant one actually about sorry, Nana, but you've got it all wrong.
Oh, bless.
And I loved that.
But then there was a double one which said, "Pulling out doesn't work," hold up on a banner, and then another woman standing next to her with another banner saying, "I should know, she's my mum." Anyway, where were we, Tom? Where were we?
Well, I think really, I would love it if Theresa May would actually say something.
Yes.
Herself. And I feel that she doesn't talk to the people enough. Or sometimes at all.
Because she hasn't got anything to say. She can't. I mean, this is where she is simultaneously trying to address the portion of the crowd that has seen the Emperor's nudity and the portion of the crowd that's still insisting that he's dressed. I genuinely don't envy her that. That's an almost impossible situation.
I mean, she's in a case. I entirely agree. But I think she could be a little bit more vocal at times like this, because these people. Do you know, James? I voted Conservative all my life. And for the first time in 70-odd years, I now do not want to vote again.
No, I get it. Well, you heard Graham in Liverpool earlier, from the opposite perspective. He's voted Labour all his life, but he'd vote Conservative if they got their finger out and actually promised to try and rescue the country from the mess that they've inflicted upon it.
Well, if they did. I mean, the only hope is that she's been playing a different game, and then ultimately we get a referendum anyway.
Well, that's the only hope, but it's increasingly forlorn. My latest theory is that she did have somewhere inside her mind a plausible plan that she thought might work, but it would never have worked. And the reason that it was never pointed out to her that it would never work is because she surrounded herself with pro-Brexit people in an attempt to sort of rub off her own Remain reputation. And that meant that none of the people in her inner circle, from the ludicrous Nick Timothy right down to the foreign secretaries that she appointed, Boris Johnson, none of them would say to her, "Theresa May, you're denying reality," because they were even further down the rabbit hole than she was.
You're right.
How's your Latin? Right. How's your Latin?
A bit shaky, actually. It's a long time ago.
Nunc est bibendum, Tom. Nunc est bibendum.
Oh, yes. I like that one.
10:47 is the time. I do the translations as well because, that's the thing about us metropolitan elites. We're always sneering at the less educated. Nunc est bibendum, of course. Now is the time for drinking. In the next hour, I'm going to talk about these. It's just been pointed out to me that I can't really disapprove of videos of racists going viral without removing many of my greatest hits from the LBC website. But there's a big difference between someone ringing a radio station and turning out to be a massive racist and someone being filmed on public transport, especially someone who may have other issues. I just want to find out what you think about that and whether or not Ryanair should be in some way censured by customers for their apparent failure to deal with a particularly toxic example of the breed on an aeroplane towards the end of last week. Before that, we're wondering what you would do if you were Theresa May. And as ever with our Brexit conversations, you're welcome to riff a little around the central tune, especially if you can do it in Latin. 10:52 is the time. Peter is in Hendon. Peter, what would you like to say?
Well, I'd like to say that how David Davis could succeed when Theresa May stuck Ollie Robinson in front of him to undermine him is quite an impossible task.
How did he undermine him?
I heard you say before.
How did he undermine him?
That signing up to the Schengen Treaty and signing up to Schengen and also being in the Euro might not be such a bad thing. I know that you're a complete idiot.
Well, that's absolutely inarguable. Why don't you hang up? Because you haven't got any other arguments to make. Oh, you already have. And there, my friends, is the sound of gammon slowly frying on the Monday morning. Matthew is in Heathrow. Matthew, what would you do if you were Theresa May?
Well, basically, I mean, what I would do is I would talk to Jeremy Corbyn and all the other parties in Parliament and say basically to support her, and then she will involve them in the trade talks. With
do you know that I presume you're being serious? I mean, we're having a conversation about Brexit, so it's hard to tell these days. But actually, I look back now and wonder whether the only chance of some sort of workable plan that did still involve leaving would have been a kind of coalition-type movement, bringing people from all parties into the negotiating process, because it's not a party political process, Brexit. It's a national one, and so the idea that it was only represented by Conservative politicians does, in retrospect, seem wrong, doesn't it?
No, that's right. I mean, the actual referendum was cross-party.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think she made the mistake that she should have actually, when she didn't get the majority, she should have made the whole thing cross-party, and just to get Brexit, that's the most important thing now. And nothing else is really happening much in Parliament until we resolve.
But Corbyn, I mean, do they want the same thing? Theresa May, I think, knows that leaving is really silly, so she's trying to mitigate the silliness of it. And Jeremy Corbyn, I think, is silly enough to think that it's a good idea. So on Brexit and Brexit alone, I think I trust Theresa May's instincts more than I trust Jeremy Corbyn. So what does she gain from bringing him into the tent?
Well, she gets his support. And
for what, though, mate? She's not, because they're not. I've got a horrible feeling that Corbyn's inner circle now are seeing carnage and chaos as being wonderful deliverers of Downing Street to the Labour Party. So they're not going to step in to save the country. They're going to sit back and let Theresa May set fire to it so that they can turn up at the next general election and claim they've got a massive hose.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I predict already the next, if they don't support Conservatives, I'm sure the next general election is going to be the formula that there has to be a coalition between Conservative and Labour, and that's what she should have done at the last election.
Coalition between Conservative and Labour. I mean, people forget, don't they, that you know, during war we have coalition governments. Churchill, of course, led famously the last wartime coalition government, but this is self-inflicted. This is, I mean, you and I are having a relatively sensible conversation, but we're overlooking the enormous elephant in the corner of the room, which is you're describing wartime circumstances that we have entirely inflicted upon ourselves. The first country in the history of the world to impose economic sanctions on itself.
Yeah, I mean, and so to make Brexit work, I mean, I was a Remainer, accepted we're going to leave, but basically we've got to get the right deal, and I think the freedom of movement is the thing what a lot of people want to stop. And basically, yeah, I mean, we can get some sort of trade deal where we don't pay as much as we're paying now and have a bit more control, what I think people want.
You'll be lucky. Control over what? I mean, it really is insane now. They're cutting and pasting all. The best case scenario is that they let us cut and paste all the deals that we've already signed up to. That's the best case scenario, and we probably won't be able to, because if we still stay out of the four pillars of freedoms, the four freedoms, as it were, then we won't be allowed to sign up on the terms that we've currently got. Yeah, you might be right. There might be a country that's not yet been discovered that we could be the first to sign a trade deal with, and that would solve all our problems. But as I say, that country hasn't been discovered yet. John's in Colchester. John, what would you do?
Well, what I would do is a kind of double-edged thing, and it worries me.
Go on.
If I was a personal friend of Theresa May's,
yes,
I'd just say, what's motivating you to get out of your bed in the morning?
Yes.
Why are you doing this?
Well, I want to know, what do you think her answer would be? I know this upsets people sometimes, but I'm quite charitable in my beliefs about what I think she's got a sense of duty.
But she's, if her husband must say to her every morning, why are you doing this? She reminds me of when Gordon Brown was going through that kind of thing.
Yes.
But my worry is...
And do you know what I would say if I woke up next to Mrs. May's husband and he asked me why I was... I think I'd say because of the alternatives, Philip. Look, if I go, it's either Corbyn or Johnson or Davis or possibly even the Mewling pencil.
Well, that's precisely the point I was going to make. I mean, I can't think of an alternative that's better. I mean, Corbyn is awful.
Oh, my God.
If he gets to the reins of the country, God help us all.
Oh, my God, he's right.
All her colleagues seem to be determined to stab whoever it is in the back.
Oh, they're a vicious and vile bunch, aren't they? They really are.
I mean, what we're heading for depresses me. I mean,
I listen
to your show and I agree with you. And I want to be able to put this point that people would actually listen. But nobody seems to be saying exactly the same thing. I just think we're stumbling into things that all the Brexiteers seem to... The words I don't know seem to be the best words ever.
They can't say it. You heard. Obviously, they're thin on the ground these days on this programme, and Peter in Hendon demonstrated precisely why. All they can do is say things that aren't true, then say something rude, and then hang up. But on a political scale, this is why people like Peter in Hendon earn my pity rather than my derision or disgust. That's what all their heroes have been doing for the last 2.5 years. They've been saying things that aren't true. They've been refusing to brook questions. How dare you interrupt? Let me finish. Yeah, but you've said something that isn't true. Come on my show, say things that are true. You won't get interrupted. So you can't pick on people like Peter in Hendon when you've got people like Johnson and Davis and Fox and Farage doing exactly the same thing. Say things that aren't true, refuse to be questioned about it, then say something rude like Ramona, and then, metaphorically speaking, hang up the phone. And that's the entire campaign in a nutshell.
But that's where, I listen to you and I agree with you and your callers. We all seem to be singing from the same song sheet. But how do we get our message out?
I don't know.
We can all talk to each other about what we like.
Yeah, well, you just presume that eventually the sight of the naked flesh in front of them will be enough to persuade them that the emperor hasn't got any clothes on. And you try, and I'm not very good at this, but you try to do it politely. Well, actually, I am quite good at it. It's only the people who are so gammonised that they don't know what day it is, who think that they're being patronised or sneered at. They're the ones that deserve to be. So you're talking about, 15% perhaps? The rest of these people, they've been conned. Clever people get conned, and our job is to help them, A, recognise the con, and B, act to minimise the impact of the con before it's too late. You know what it all boils down to, don't you, John?
Tell me.
O tempora. O tempora, o mores.
Well, I hope that's clean.
That certainly is. I hope it. Yeah, I haven't read out any of the phrases people have sent to me for precisely that reason, in case you were smuggling in something smutty under the guise of a Latinate camouflage. 10:59 is the time. Thank you for that. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. Special message to Peter in Hendon. I mean that, sir. I do pity you rather than reflect your rudeness to me. But just do some reading, please, soon. We move on now to something completely different. A story that